The searchlight swung across the road and found her face full on. Tires hissed under her as she pedaled into the beam, hands steady on the bars, a canvas satchel thumping her ribs. A Feldgendarmerie sergeant stepped out from the shadow of a plane tree, palm up. Behind him, a truck idled, 2 rifles poking from the back. It was July 1944 in the Massif Central, curfew in force, and every checkpoint in France felt wired to explode. She coasted to a stop, feet on the gravel. "Papers," he said. Nancy Wake smiled with the tired irritation of a woman running errands for a sick uncle, passed over forged documents, watched the man scan them without understanding he was holding the reason his garrison might not eat this week. A horn bleated behind the truck. The sergeant waved her on. She clipped back in and pushed hard. She had 200 miles to ride before night, and a code to retrieve that would bring guns and money down from the sky. Years earlier, Nancy had arrived in Paris with the buoyancy of someone who meant to live fast and well. She'd grown up in New Zealand and Australia, learned how to bluff early, and trained as a journalist. In Vienna in 1933, she saw a man in jackboots whip a Jewish passerby, and the sound of it soldered something in her. By 1939, she was in Marseille, married to Henri Fiocca, a wealthy, decent man whose business bought him access to rooms where useful conversations happened. War made those rooms harder to protect, and the sidewalks more dangerous. France fell, Vichy formed, and the German tricolor walked through train stations like it had never learned to stop. If you worked in Marseille and cared about people whose papers no longer opened doors, you learned quick geography. Which consul stamped visas, which gendarme looked away, which cove hid a fishing boat, which hill road bent behind a blind wall where you could switch a suitcase with a satchel and keep your pulse under control. Nancy ran those routes. She smuggled messages, cash, food, people, Jews and downed airmen through a city that pretended to be normal while watching itself in every shop window. The Gestapo began hearing about a woman who showed up where their net had just been and slipped away before the next knot tightened. They called her La Souris Blanche, the white mouse. The work turned from favor to job. She joined a resistance circuit and learned the discipline that keeps couriers alive. Leave no pattern, trust few, burn what you touch. She could drink a collaborator under a table, laugh at his jokes, and remember exactly which drawer in his desk held an unregistered stamp. She moved through checkpoints with a heavy-lidded boredom that read as innocence. More than once she raged at herself in private for loving the speed of it, then went out again because the alternative was watching people disappear. In 1943, the net finally lay too tight. A mass arrest hit Marseille. Friends went quiet or to ground. Nancy ran, by train to Toulouse, then on foot across the Pyrenees with a guide who cursed the weather and the weight of her stubbornness. In Spain, she waited in cells and safe houses until the British got her out. London offered a choice: sit out the war and live, or learn how to jump from planes and blow bridges. She chose the second before the recruiter finished his sentence. At Special Operations Executive School, she fired stens until the recoil rode her shoulders like a live animal, learned to pick locks, memorize routes, strip charges, and keep a room clear. In a mock interrogation, she broke a pencil and used the sudden scatter to reset her face. In parachute training, she knocked the wind out of herself on the first landing, stood up, and went again. In April 1944, codename Hélène, to the Maquis she would be Madame André, she flew out over a moonlit France and stepped into air over the Auvergne. She hit the ground hard, wrapped in silk, and a Frenchman's gallows cheer greeted her. "I hope all the trees in France bear such beautiful fruit." She laughed, rolled to her stomach, and reached for the bundle that held her radio crystals and cash. Her job was liaison, grease between London and the Maquis. With 2 other agents, she fed a patchwork army, farm boys, miners, veterans, and men who had refused Vichy or German labor and retreated to the hills. They were brave and undisciplined, hungry and proud. She brought them steel, money to buy food and loyalty, instructions for sabotage, schedules for parachute drops, and the steadying fact that someone out there, beyond the sea, knew their names. Her cover was the audacity of daylight. She bicycled from farm to farm with a string bag and a story, slept where she could, and hid a pistol where her hand would find it before her brain could form a plan. When a vital set of radio codes was lost in a raid, the cells linked to London went dead. Without those phrases, there would be no drop, no ammo, no money. Nancy took a bicycle and an old coat and rode almost non-stop to another circuit, roughly 300 miles there and back on roads patrolled by gendarmerie and Wehrmacht, her legs pumping through villages where men stared at the horizon like it could be forced to change. She beat curfew, blew through roadblocks with a scold, and came home with the words that would bring Spitfire green containers down onto dark fields. With D-Day approaching, her group cut rails, blew bridges, and turned German schedules into confetti. She negotiated hard with chiefs whose pride could trip an operation, fired messages back to London telling supply planes where a pasture would be clear, and held a Maquis column together when fear ran in the ranks like cold water. She often traveled with a wad of banknotes and a bottle, knowing both could get her through doors better than a gun. When a local commandant prepared to hang a suspected traitor without proof, she argued him down then and there, because losing an ally to rage was a luxury they could not afford. German response grew vicious. Raids burned farms flat. In retaliation, Nancy's group hit garrisons, ambushed convoys, and stripped wrecks for rifles before the smoke cleared. She did what the job required. Later, people would embroider her nights with lurid rumor, but the record that matters shows a woman who managed money and men, aimed disruption with a map, and carried messages across ground where a wrong word could end a town. Here the story loops back to Marseille, with a punch that never stopped working on her. After the war, she learned what the Gestapo had done to her husband. Henri had refused to give up her whereabouts, even under torture. They shot him in 1943. She had suspected. Confirmation knocked her breath out in London like the moment after a parachute opening shock. She rarely spoke about it, except to say she had killed as many Germans as possible because that was all she had left. By late summer 1944, Allied columns rolled north, and Nancy's hills erupted into daylight. The Maquis came down bearded and grinning, their boots held together with wire and luck. She rode with them sometimes, a scarf over her hair, a sten on her shoulder, and told a captain to keep his men from celebrating with a massacre. Cities shook out flags kept under floorboards. Old scores were settled in streets, and she tried to keep revenge from turning into policy. Then the regular armies wore through, uniforms replaced armbands, and the work that had needed improvisation turned into forms and cues. She turned in her radio and her pistol and dreamed of sleep that did not startle her awake. The gratitude of governments arrived in medal and ribbon. Britain gave her the George Medal. France gave her the Médaille de la Résistance, and later the Légion d'honneur, 3 times over the years. The United States awarded her the Medal of Freedom. Australia, delayed and complicated in its thanks, eventually recognized her with its own honors. She tried elected politics for a time and lost with good humor. She worked, married again, and outlived several waves of people who thought resistance looked easy from a comfortable distance. What stayed true was the simple outline. A journalist who had watched a public beating in the 1930s grew into a courier who saw how to move a person across a dangerous street, became a partisan who could tell a squad where to lay a charge, so a bridge would be useless for a week, and survived because she made choices at speed with a kind of cheerful fatalism. The Gestapo's nickname had been meant as a curse. She wore it like a dare. When officers tried to catch her on patterns, she made herself new. When fear showed in a room, She filled it with action until there was no space left for terror to sit. Long after, in a London nursing home, someone asked whether she had been afraid. She said yes, often, but it never stopped her legs. The old bike was gone, the hills quiet, the fields no longer marked by the burn scars of parachute flares. Yet the picture still holds: a road, a beam of light, a woman with forged papers and a story ready, lifting her chin and pedaling on. Thank you for listening to Last Post History. Subscribe for more true stories from the world at war.